The city was still asleep when the aircraft took off. Below, Hiroshima lay quiet in the early morning light. Wooden houses followed the curve of the river. Trams stood motionless on empty streets. There were no sirens, no evacuations, no sign that this city had been selected to become a turning point in human history. Inside the bomber, the crew moved with practiced calm. Orders were followed, checklists completed. The object beneath the aircraft was sealed and silent, carrying a force no one aboard had ever seen used before. At 8:15 a.m., it was released in a single flash. The city ceased to exist as it had been. Heat erased streets. Light burned shadows into stone. In seconds, tens of thousands were dead. In the days that followed, countless more would die without wounds. Without explanation, history would later call this the moment the war ended, but long before the aircraft left the runway. The moment had already been debated, in offices and laboratories thousands of miles away. Men had warned that this weapon would not simply destroy a city. It would cross a boundary that could never be restored. It would change how wars were fought, and how humanity understood its own capacity for annihilation. Those warnings were written, discussed, acknowledged, and then ignored. This is not the story of how Hiroshima was destroyed. It is the story of the people who saw what was coming and failed to stop it. By the summer of 1945, the war in Europe was over, but the war in the Pacific refused to end cleanly. Japan had lost its navy, its air power, and much of its industry, yet surrender did not come. Every island campaign had shown the same pattern: fierce resistance, staggering casualties, and a willingness to fight beyond logic. In Washington, the question was no longer whether the war could be won, but how much blood would be spent to finish it. The planned invasion of Japan operation. Downfall promised casualties on a scale few dared to imagine. Military estimates varied, but none were reassuring. Hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers could die. Japanese civilian losses would be even higher. The memory of Okinawa was still fresh, a battlefield where civilians were drawn into mass death, not by accident, but by design. Into this calculation entered a weapon unlike any other. The atomic bomb had been developed in secrecy, at enormous cost, and with unprecedented scientific effort. Its power was theoretical, tested only once in a desert far from cities. It offered something irresistible to exhausted decision-makers: finality, one strike. A shock so overwhelming that resistance would buy assistance would collapse instantly. But not everyone accepted that promise without fear. Within the military, the government, and the scientific community, warnings began to surface. Some questioned whether Japan was already close to surrender. Others warned that using the bomb on a city would not simply end a war, but inaugurate a new age of warfare, one where annihilation could be delivered in a single moment. There were concerns about precedent, about escalation, about what would happen when this weapon no longer belonged to only one nation. These were not abstract moral musings. They were strategic fears. Once the bomb was used, it could never be unused. The barrier that separated conventional war from total destruction would be gone forever. Yet the context of 1945 crushed hesitation. The war had brutalized everyone involved. Firebombing had already destroyed entire cities. Civilian deaths had become a grim metric of progress. Against that backdrop, the atomic bomb appeared not as a rupture, but as an acceleration of what was already happening. And there was another force at work, quieter but decisive. Momentum, the project was complete. The weapon was ready. The machinery of war had aligned itself toward a single, irreversible action. To stop now would require not just doubt, but the courage to accept prolonged conflict and uncertain consequences. In that environment, warnings became obstacles. They did not disappear. They were acknowledged, summarized, and filed. But they could not compete with the desire for closure. The bomb promised an ending. The warnings promised complexity. History, in moments like this, tends to choose simplicity. That is why Hiroshima matters not only as a site of destruction, but as the point where humanity chose a future it fully understood and still decided to enter. Long before the bomb was loaded onto an aircraft, the doubts had already taken shape quietly. In places far removed from battlefields and headlines, they emerged in laboratories where physicists had spent years racing against time, convinced that Nazi Germany might reach the weapon first. When that threat vanished with Germany's defeat, a different fear replaced it. The question was no longer whether the bomb could be built. It was whether it should be used as planned. Some of the scientists who had unlocked its power understood its implications more clearly than anyone else. They had calculated the blast radius. They had modeled the heat. They knew that this was not simply a larger explosive, but a fundamental break from every weapon that had come before. What troubled them was not only the immediate destruction, but the permanence of the act. Once used, the bomb would redefine the boundaries of war forever. One of the most visible figures among them was J. Robert Oppenheimer. Publicly, he fulfilled his role. Privately, he wrestled with the weight of what had been created. Others went further than doubt. They tried to intervene. Memoranda were written. Meetings were requested. Proposals were drafted suggesting alternatives, a demonstration of the bomb's power away from cities. Diplomatic pressure, backed by proof rather than annihilation. A pause to test whether Japan might surrender under the shock of revelation alone. These warnings did not come from pacifists. They came from people who understood war intimately, who had contributed to its machinery and now saw where it was heading. Within the military, similar doubts existed. Some senior officers questioned whether the bomb was necessary at all. Japan's capacity to continue the war was collapsing. Its cities lay in ruins from conventional bombing. A naval blockade was tightening. The difference between ending the war in weeks versus months did not seem, to them, worth crossing a line that could never be redrawn. But these voices lacked unity. They spoke separately, cautiously, each assuming others would carry the argument further. No single warning arrived with enough force to halt the process, and none of them held decisive authority over the final choice. Above all, they underestimated the environment they were speaking into. By mid-1945, the American leadership was not looking for debate. It was looking for resolution. The bomb was framed not as a moral dilemma, but as a tool, one that could save lives by ending the war quickly. Any argument against its use had to compete with that promise, and with the exhaustion of a nation that had been fighting for years. In such moments, hesitation appears irresponsible. Caution looks like weakness. And warnings, no matter how informed, sound like obstacles to victory. The men who raised these concerns were not silenced. They were listened to politely. Their arguments were summarized. Their documents were archived, and then the machinery moved on. History often imagines pivotal decisions as confrontations, shouting matches, dramatic refusals, last-minute reversals. The reality is quieter. The warning fades, not because it is rejected, but because it fails to change direction by the time the final order was signed. The people who had tried to stop the moment understood something too late. They were not arguing against a decision. They were arguing against momentum. The decision was not announced with drama. It did not arrive as a declaration to be debated or challenged. It moved forward the way large decisions often do, quietly, through confirmation rather than confrontation. Committees met. Options were reviewed. Language softened. The question of whether to use the bomb gradually became a discussion of how to use it. Targets were assessed not as communities, but as coordinates. Weather patterns mattered more than human presence. The moment crossed a line where reversal would require an act of defiance, not disagreement. On August 6, 1945, that moment became irreversible. When the bomb detonated over Hiroshima, the scale of destruction exceeded even the most cautious projections. The blast erased neighborhoods instantly. Heat ignited flesh and wood alike. People who had survived the initial flash wandered the ruins without wounds that could be seen, only to collapse hours or days later as radiation took hold. Those who had warned about the weapon's consequences did not need reports to understand what had happened. They recognized the outcome not only in photographs and casualty estimates, but in the silence that followed. A new category of destruction had entered the world. 3 days later, it happened again. Nagasaki confirmed that Hiroshima was not an anomaly. It was policy. Japan surrendered soon after. The war ended. The justification hardened immediately. The bomb had saved lives. It had prevented invasion. It had shortened the war. These claims were repeated until they felt definitive, but history rarely pauses to examine. The alternatives it discarded. The warnings that had been raised before Hiroshima did not disappear after it. They resurfaced in a different form: regret, restraint, and a dawning recognition that something uncontrollable had been unleashed. The men who had once tried to prevent the bomb's use now turned their attention to limiting its future. The consequences extended far beyond. Japan nuclear weapons reshaped global politics overnight. Fear replaced distance as a deterrent. Wars would no longer be fought only on battlefields, but in calculations of annihilation. Cities became hostages to strategy. Civilization itself became a variable in military planning. The irony was brutal. The bomb was meant to end a war, and it did. But it also ensured that no future war between major powers could ever be considered safely winnable. The warnings that had been dismissed before Hiroshima became the foundation of post-war caution. Yet by then, the line had already been crossed. History often frames turning points as moments of clarity. Hiroshima was not one of them. It was a moment of acceptance that a boundary had been broken, and that the world would now have to live inside the consequences for those who had tried to stop it. The outcome carried a particular weight. Their failure was not measured in policy memos or lost arguments, but in the permanence of what followed. Once the bomb was used, the debate ended. Not because it had been resolved, but because it no longer mattered. After the war, the story needed an ending that felt clean. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were framed as tragic necessities, terrible but decisive. The narrative settled quickly. The bomb had ended the war, saved countless lives, and spared the world from a bloodbath that would have followed an invasion of Japan. In this version of history, there was no space for hesitation, and no value in remembering dissent. The men who had warned against using the bomb did not disappear. They were simply absorbed into silence. Their objections had never been loud enough to become scandal. They were cautious, technical, framed in language of risk rather than protest. When the outcome delivered surrender, their warnings were retroactively stripped of relevance. Victory has a way of rewriting doubt. As there was also power at work, admitting that alternatives existed and were seriously considered would have complicated moral authority at the dawn of the post-war order. The United States emerged not only as a military victor, but as the architect of a new global system. That position depended on certainty. Acknowledging that the most consequential decision of the war had been contested from within would have fractured the clarity of that authority, so history simplified. The decision became inevitable. The warnings became footnotes. The people who raised them were remembered for their achievements, not for the moment they tried and failed to change the course of events. Some of those voices later spoke out, expressing regret or calling for restraint in the nuclear age that followed. But by then, the world had already moved on. The bomb was no longer a question of use, but of control. The debate shifted from should to how many, and perhaps most importantly, the nature of the warning itself worked against. Remembrance, there was no single memo that could be pointed to as the moment's history ignored. No dramatic refusal. No confrontation that could be filmed or quoted. The resistance was fragmented, cautious, and procedural, exactly the kind that vanishes when outcomes demand simplicity. History tends to remember heroes who succeed, and villains who fail spectacularly. It rarely remembers those who were right too early, and without the power to stop what was already in motion. The story of Hiroshima does not lack voices of conscience. It lacks the willingness to keep listening to them, and so, the warning survives only in fragments, in declassified documents, in memoirs written years too late, and in the uneasy feeling that the world crossed a line long before it fully understood where that line would lead. In the decades that followed Hiroshima, the world learned to live under a shadow it could never escape. Cities were rebuilt. Memorials were erected. Dates were carved into stone. But beneath the language of remembrance lay a quieter inheritance. The knowledge that humanity now possessed the ability to end itself in a single decision. The men who had warned against using the atomic bomb did not vanish from history entirely. Their influence simply changed form. They became advocates for restraint, architects of arms control, voices urging caution in a world where caution had become the last defense against annihilation. Their warnings, once dismissed as inconvenient, returned as doctrine. But doctrine always arrives too late. The true legacy of Hiroshima is not found only in radiation sickness, ruined cities, or geopolitical rivalry. It lives in the permanent tension between power and responsibility. In every moment when leaders weigh speed against consequence. In every calculation where efficiency threatens to eclipse humanity. What makes this story difficult is not that the warning was ignored, it is that it was understood. The people who raised it were not naive. They knew the stakes. They knew the war was brutal, the enemy resolute, the pressure immense. And yet, they also knew that some actions do not merely end conflicts, they redefine what conflict means. Forever history often comforts itself by claiming there was no other way, but that comfort depends on forgetting the moment when other ways were still possible. Hiroshima is remembered as the day the war ended, less often as the day a future was locked in, a future where fear would replace distance, where survival would depend on restraint rather than victory, where the greatest danger would not be ignorance, but certainty. The warning before Hiroshima did not fail because it lacked truth. It failed because truth alone is not enough to stop momentum, and that is the lesson that endures. Not that humanity is capable of destruction, but that even when we see the edge clearly, we are still capable of stepping over it and calling the fall necessary.